The word struck, sharp and impossible, freezing the world around him. I still love him. I need to be there. His wife, Hannah, had looked him dead in the eyes, her voice raw with an urgency that obliterated 3 years of marriage, 5 years of shared life. One moment, they were picking a movie, the next, his future was being rewritten by a stranger's tragedy. He drove her, the road a blurry tunnel, her silent tears a constant pressure in the passenger seat. He felt the sickening lurch in his gut as she sprang from the car, not waiting for it to fully stop, sprinting towards the glowing emergency doors of the hospital. He had believed they were happy. Together for 5 years, married for 3, and the easy rhythm of their life felt like a foundation. Kids were on the horizon, a future meticulously, lovingly planned. Hannah, he'd thought, was an open book. He knew her every quirk, every dream. It hadn't occurred to him that someone could be so adept at concealing entire sections of their heart. Their story had begun with a laugh, hers, at some clumsy joke he'd made at a mutual friend's birthday. It had drawn him in, a genuine, unburdened sound. They'd bonded over true crime podcasts and terrible horror movies, a shared, quirky intimacy. Within 6 months, they were inseparable. The wedding had been effortless, a natural progression, and their life together had settled into a comfortable ease. Owen. The name had always been peripheral, a ghost from a past Hannah had dismissed with a casual wave of her hand. Her high school sweetheart, the kind of first love that sounded almost cinematic in its retelling. They'd dated from sophomore year through 2 years of college, then, she'd explained, simply grew apart when different universities pulled them in separate directions. A mutual, mature parting, 2 people with different futures. Her tone whenever his name arose, which wasn't often, always conveyed a sense of ancient history. We were kids, she'd say, a soft chuckle, we didn't know what we wanted. He'd never had cause to doubt her. He wasn't the jealous type, and an ex from 7 years ago seemed harmless. He hadn't felt threatened, hadn't asked probing questions. Why would he need to? Yet, looking back, there were moments. Tiny ripples that should have created larger waves. A few months ago, a distant look would cloud her eyes when Owen's name came up in conversation among their overlapping hometown friends. Her phone, once an extension of her hand, began to flip over instinctively whenever he entered the room. She'd started staying up later, scrolling through something she'd quickly close if he asked what held her attention. He'd chalked it up to work stress, a demanding new project at her marketing firm, the exhaustion visible in her eyes. There was that night, 6 weeks before the hospital incident, watching a movie. He'd reached for her hand, and her touch was there, but her mind seemed a million miles away. He remembered asking if she was okay, her forced smile as she snapped back, "Yeah, sorry, just thinking about the campaign." He'd wanted to believe her. So he had. Then came that Friday evening, a sudden, brutal incision in the fabric of their routine. They were on the couch, dinner done, scrolling through Netflix. Her phone rang. The number must have been instantly recognizable, her face went completely white. She snatched the device so fast it almost slipped from her trembling fingers. He watched her hands shake as she answered, heard her voice crack, small and desperate, "Please tell me he's alive. Please." His stomach dropped before he could even comprehend. She listened, perhaps 20 seconds, her free hand clamped over her mouth, tears already tracking down her cheeks. When she finally hung up, the words barely escaped her lips, fragmented and raw, "It's Owen. Serious car accident." They said, "It's bad." A strange mix of sympathy and bewilderment swirled within him. Why such devastation for an ex from nearly a decade past? Then came the line, branded into his memory, destined to replay in his mind for eternity. She gripped his arm, hard enough to leave marks, her eyes burning. "I still love him. I need to be there. Drive me now." It wasn't a plea. It was a command. No hesitation, no awareness of the ruin those words would sow, it felt as though someone had reached into his chest and torn out something vital. He stood there, frozen, the sounds of his own apartment muffled by the ringing in his ears, struggling to process if he'd truly heard her. She was already grabbing her purse and keys, his response apparently irrelevant. His mind screamed for him to refuse, to demand an explanation, to do anything but comply. But his body moved on autopilot. Okay, he heard himself say, though nothing about this was okay. The 20-minute drive to the hospital stretched into hours. She remained silent, staring out the window, tears tracing paths down her face. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the internal debate a raging storm. If he refused, he'd be the heartless husband, unfeeling in a crisis. If he drove her, he was tacitly endorsing her choice to run to another man. There was no winning. He kept driving, a ghost of the good husband he desperately wanted to be, even after she'd admitted to loving someone else. As they pulled up to the emergency entrance, she was out of the car before it fully stopped, a blur of motion sprinting towards the automatic doors. He parked, then followed, walking numbly through the sterile corridors, past the fluorescent glow of waiting rooms, until he reached the ICU area. That's where he saw them. Hannah, enveloped in the arms of Owen's family. His mother stroked her hair as she sobbed into another woman's shoulder. Owen's father guided her towards a private room. He watched from 30 feet away as she disappeared inside. Through the narrow window, he saw her reach for Owen's hand, lean over his bed. The way she looked at him. It was a crushing, visceral recognition. That look. It was the same way she had looked at him during their first year, as if Owen were her entire world. In that moment, he ceased to be her husband. He was merely the driver who had delivered her to the man she truly wanted. He didn't wait. He didn't want to see how long she'd stay, or if she'd ever remember he existed. The drive home was a profound silence, devoid of music, podcasts, just the thud of his own breathing and the occasional distant car. Back in their apartment, he moved through the familiar rooms like a phantom. He pulled the large suitcase from the closet, mechanically filling it with clothes, toiletries, his laptop, a few irreplaceable items. The shared things, the picture frames, the kitchen gadgets, the throw pillows she'd chosen, none of it felt like his anymore. He retrieved his passport, his birth certificate, anything vital for whatever came next. Before he left, he found a grocery receipt, scribbled on its back, "He can have you now." What else was there to say? She'd already made it abundantly clear. He propped the note against the coffee maker, where she would undoubtedly see it first thing in the morning, grabbed his bags, and walked out without a backward glance. He checked into a hotel near his office, the lobby's fluorescent lights harsh, and collapsed onto the stiff bed, his phone still clutched in his hand. Then, it began to explode. By the time he woke the next morning, the phone screen was a mosaic of notifications, 47 missed calls, over 60 text messages, all Hannah. He scrolled through them, watching the tone shift. The earliest, from around 2 a.m., were frantic, asking where he was, if he was safe. By 6 a.m., they were accusatory, demanding to know how he could just leave without talking to her. Not one asked how he was feeling, not one acknowledged what she had said. It was all about her inconvenience, her confusion. He couldn't bring himself to respond immediately. He showered, dressed, then sat on the edge of the hotel bed for 20 minutes, staring at the screen. Finally, he typed, "We needed space." Her response flashed back in less than 30 seconds. A wall of text, claiming he'd misunderstood everything, that she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She was in shock, she insisted. People say things they don't mean in emergencies. But he remembered the conviction in her voice, the certainty, as if those words had been waiting, primed, for the moment they could escape. He typed back, "You didn't hesitate for even a second," then turned his phone off, unable to watch her attempt to rewrite what he had witnessed with his own eyes. When he finally powered it back on hours later, her strategy had completely pivoted. Now, he was insecure, overreacting to a crisis. Any decent husband would have understood she was just worried about an old friend. She even used the word platonic in one message, as if his world-shattering declaration of love was merely a statement of deep friendship. The gaslighting was so blatant, it would have been darkly comical if it wasn't tearing him apart. She wasn't sorry for what she'd said. She was angry that he wasn't playing along. By Sunday afternoon, the social pressure began. Sophie, her best friend, sent a long message about Hannah's devastation, urging him to stop being stubborn and come home. Two of their mutual friends from Hannah's side called, their tones betraying the sanitized version of events Hannah had fed them, a family emergency, his abandonment. He didn't defend himself. He was too exhausted, and part of him was curious to see how far she would push this narrative. His brother called that evening, asking what the hell was going on, everyone saying he'd left Hannah at a hospital. When he told him the actual story, the exact words she'd used, his brother went quiet for a long time. "That's not what people are hearing at all," he finally said. The only one who seemed to smell something off was Caleb, his best friend. They met for coffee Monday morning. He laid out everything, no edits, no softening. Caleb listened, unblinking. When he finished, Caleb leaned back in his chair. "That doesn't track," he said, his voice flat. "Something else is going on here." A wave of relief washed over him, at least one person believed him. Caleb reminded him how distant Hannah had been for months, distracted. He mentioned that his girlfriend had heard through the grapevine Hannah used to talk about Owen as the one that got away. He dismissed those comments then, writing them off as nostalgic reminiscing. Now, they felt like breadcrumbs. Caleb's words planted a seed he couldn't shake. He started replaying the last year in his mind. Little things that had seemed innocuous now clicked into a chilling pattern. The way she'd perked up when Owen got engaged 15 months ago. Her almost palpable relief 10 months back when news filtered through mutual friends that the engagement had been called off. The weekend trip she'd taken to her hometown 4 months ago, without him, claiming it was just with old friends. He wondered, now, if Owen had been anywhere near that town. The late-night phone calls she'd taken in the bathroom, whispering, claiming it was her mother with insomnia, needing to talk. He hadn't been planning to actively seek proof. The thought of snooping through his wife's things felt antithetical to everything he believed. But life, he was learning, had a funny way of handing you answers when you stopped searching for them. On Tuesday evening, he stopped by the apartment while Hannah was at work, needing more clothes. Her laptop was open on the kitchen counter. He wasn't looking, he was simply walking past it, headed for the bedroom. A notification popped up from a messaging app he didn't recognize. The preview was just visible enough, never stopping thinking about someone. The sender, a single letter, O, his hands began to shake. He moved the mouse, stopping the screen from going dark. He knew he shouldn't look. He knew this was crossing a line. But he also knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that he deserved to understand what he was truly dealing with. The chat thread was long, stretching back months. He scrolled for barely 30 seconds before he had everything he needed. Messages from Hannah, lamenting choosing wrong, regretting not fighting for their relationship, claiming Owen belonged with her, not with whoever else he'd been seeing. Messages talking about their last summer before college, how she thought about it every single day. Owen's replies were just as damning, about never getting over her, how his failed engagement was because he kept comparing everyone to Hannah. There were messages about meeting up when she was in town, conversations about what their life could have been, plans that aligned precisely with that trip she'd taken 4 months ago. He didn't read every single message. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough. He pulled out his phone, photographed the screen, ensuring dates and context were visible, then emailed them to himself. He closed the laptop. Walked out. The drive back to the hotel was a blur. His hands, strangely, were steady on the wheel. No shaking, no tears. Just a cold, hard clarity settling over him, like ice water. The grief he'd been carrying for days crystallized into something harder, cleaner, something that felt like acceptance. He wasn't losing his mind. He wasn't overreacting. He wasn't insecure. He was finally seeing the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Back in his hotel room, he sat for a long time, staring at the screenshots. A part of him had hoped to find nothing, to feel stupid for doubting her. Instead, he found validation, a truth more painful than any betrayal, because it meant months of his life had been a lie. She'd been emotionally cheating, probably longer than these messages even hinted. She'd been so good at hiding it, he'd never suspected a thing. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted completely, had been living a double life where he was merely the safe choice, while she pined for someone else. Caleb arrived that night with food, finding him still sitting there, laptop open to the photos. Caleb read through them, his face hardening in a way he'd never seen before. He simply said, "Lawyer, now. First thing tomorrow." He nodded. He knew Caleb was right. There was no coming back from this, even if a foolish, fragile part of him still wanted to try. He called Mr. Bennett, a divorce attorney Caleb's cousin had used, leaving a voicemail explaining the urgency for a consultation. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full, crushing weight of what he had lost. Hannah must have sensed the shift. By Thursday, she appeared at his office. His assistant tried to stop her, but Hannah pushed past, walking straight into the conference room where he was reviewing reports. She looked terrible, ravaged by sleepless nights, her eyes red and swollen. She began to beg, pleading with him to talk, claiming he was ruining everything over a misunderstanding, that they could fix it if he would just come home and listen. He remained calm, his voice level. He told her she had made her choice when she uttered those words, and that he had no interest in hearing revised versions of the truth. She reached for his hand, he pulled away. He watched her face shift, desperation giving way to anger. She accused him of being cold, unforgiving, throwing away their marriage over one moment of panic. He just looked at her. "You chose him. Own it." Her face crumpled. Security escorted her out. He had to sit in his car for 20 minutes afterwards, his hands trembling uncontrollably. A part of him felt guilty for his harshness, but a larger part knew any softness would be interpreted as weakness, an opening for her to manipulate him back into the role of understanding husband. He had played that role for too long already, and it had led him nowhere but to a parking lot, on the verge of breakdown. The truth began to unravel on its own, without his intervention. A few weeks later, one of their mutual friends saw Hannah and Owen having lunch at a downtown cafe, making no effort to hide their familiarity. Owen had recovered enough from his injuries to be out, looking healthier than anyone expected given the severity of the accident. Word spread quickly through their social circle, and suddenly, people began re-evaluating the narrative Hannah had carefully constructed. His brother called, apologizing for having doubted him initially. Even Sophie sent a message, admitting she'd always suspected Hannah still had feelings for Owen but hadn't felt it was her place to say anything. Owen himself seemed utterly unbothered by the unfolding chaos, posting photos on social media of himself back to normal life, Hannah visible in the background of more than one shot. The legal process moved forward. 6 weeks after he had left, they ended up in mediation. Hannah brought her own lawyer. The four of them sat in a conference room that felt far too small for the palpable tension it held. Her attorney attempted to paint him as the villain who had abandoned his wife during a crisis, suggesting he owed her significant compensation for emotional distress. It was then that Mr. Bennett calmly produced the printed copies of the messages he had photographed. He slid them across the table. He watched Hannah's face drain of color as her lawyer read through them. Mr. Bennett stated, clearly and unequivocally, that these messages proved months of emotional infidelity and deception, that trauma did not type paragraphs about choosing the wrong person. The room fell completely silent. Hannah tried to speak, tried to explain that the messages were out of context, that they didn't mean what they looked like. But even her own lawyer looked profoundly uncomfortable with the evidence laid bare in black and white. The mediation concluded with a fair split of assets and a divorce timeline far shorter than he'd anticipated, mostly because Hannah's legal position had collapsed entirely once the proof was on the table. He signed the papers, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of finality, like closing a book he'd stopped reading chapters ago. The months that followed were a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. He found a decent apartment downtown, started therapy every other week to process the betrayal and the gaslighting, slowly beginning to feel like himself again. He picked up running in the mornings, an activity he'd abandoned when Hannah expressed dislike for him being gone so early. He started cooking meals he actually enjoyed, no longer compromising solely on her preferences. He reconnected with friends he'd drifted away from during the marriage. His apartment was quiet, but it felt peaceful, not lonely. He adopted a 3-year-old mutt from the shelter, a dog named Rocket, who seemed as ready for a fresh start as he was. He heard through the grapevine that Hannah and Owen had attempted to make a real go of it after everything settled, officially together, telling people they'd rekindled their connection after all these years. He didn't care enough to feel anger anymore. It was like hearing news about strangers who vaguely resembled people he used to know. Caleb mentioned seeing them at a restaurant once, noted they looked tense, that the fantasy they'd built in secret messages probably wasn't surviving the harsh reality of an actual relationship. He didn't want details. They weren't his problem anymore. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, a text arrived from an unfamiliar number. The message immediately identified itself. It was Hannah, from a new phone, saying things with Owen weren't what she'd thought they'd be, asking if they could talk. She said she'd made a mistake, that she understood now what she'd thrown away. The connection she thought she had with Owen, she wrote, was based on nostalgia rather than reality. He read the message twice, felt absolutely nothing, and blocked the number without responding. There was nothing to say to her that would change anything, no conversation that would undo months of lies and manipulation. He had already wasted enough time trying to understand someone who had never truly chosen him in the first place. Sitting there on his couch, Rocket's head resting in his lap, he realized Hannah had kept him as a placeholder, the safe, reliable option, while she pined for a man she'd built into a fantasy. The pedestal she'd placed Owen on had finally crumbled under the weight of reality, but by then, he was already gone. She had wanted him there to catch her when it inevitably fell apart, wanted him to play the role of backup plan one last time. But he had learned he deserved to be someone's first choice, or no choice at all. Owen could have her now. They truly deserved each other. He had his life back, his peace back, and for the first time in over a year, he could breathe without constantly wondering what she was hiding. That was worth more than any apology she could offer. Worth more than any explanation or second chance. Because he finally understood that the problem had never been about him not being enough. It had been about her never being honest about what she actually wanted. And now, she would have to live with that choice, while he got to move forward without her. What did he want to build with this newfound freedom?